Welcome to Tech with Kaushik. This is part 14 of our complete practice question series for the DVA-C02 AWS Certified Developer Associate exam. Choose your answer before the timer ends, then review the correct answer, explanation, and exam tip. Let us begin part 14. Question number 532. A Lambda function must reach private services inside a VPC. The team wants the standard manage configuration with the least operational overhead. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A. Route the function through a VPN connection. Option B. Attach the function to appropriate private subnets and associate a security group that permits the required traffic. Option C. Create a private link service for every private resource. Option D. Route a VPC endpoint through a NAT gateway and attach the endpoint to Lambda. The correct answer is B. Attach the function to appropriate private subnets and associate a security group that permits the required traffic. Here is why. Lambda creates managed network interfaces in the selected VPC subnets, and the security group controls access to the private resources. Why are the other options not correct? A. No VPN is required for resources in the same VPC. C. Private link is unnecessary for ordinary private VPC connectivity. D. VPC endpoints and NAT gateways solve different connectivity paths and are not attached directly to Lambda. Exam tip. Configure Lambda VPC subnets and security groups to reach private VPC resources. Question number 533. A team develops a serverless event-driven application. It needs standardized infrastructure as code templates, local function and event testing, and deployment through an existing code pipeline workflow. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A. Define the application with AWS SAM and add SAM build, test, package, and deployment commands to the existing pipeline. Option B. Define infrastructure in Amazon State's language and start the state machine from the pipeline. Option C. Use a standalone SAM deployment script outside the existing pipeline. Option D. Use only a generic cloud formation template and build a separate pipeline. The correct answer is A. Define the application with AWS SAM and add SAM build, test, package, and deployment commands to the existing pipeline. Here is why. SAM provides standardized serverless templates and local emulation, while the existing code pipeline workflow can execute the SAM CLI deployment steps. Why are the other options not correct? B. Amazon State's language defines workflows, not all infrastructure. C. A separate script bypasses the required pipeline integration. D. It omits SAM's local serverless testing and unnecessarily creates another pipeline. Exam tip. Use SAM for serverless infrastructure as code and local testing, then run SAM commands in the existing CI/CD pipeline. Question number 534. Trade confirmations must be sent as SMS messages in each user's trade order. Duplicate. Confirmation processing must be prevented before the SMS request is submitted. Which design meets the requirement? Option A. Send records directly from data firehose to mobile phone numbers. Option B. Publish directly from an SNS FIFO topic to SMS subscriptions. Option C. Put confirmations in an SQS FIFO queue using one message group per user, then use an idempotent Lambda consumer to publish each SMS through a supported messaging service. Option D. Configure event bridge pipes with arbitrary phone numbers as direct targets. The correct answer is C. Put confirmations in an SQS FIFO queue using one message group per user, then use an idempotent Lambda consumer to publish each SMS through a supported messaging service. Here is why. FIFO message groups preserve per user order, deduplication reduces repeated sends, and the consumer performs the supported SMS delivery call. Why are the other options not correct? A. Firehose does not deliver to phone numbers. B. SNS FIFO does not support direct SMS subscriptions. D. Phone numbers are not arbitrary event bridge pipes targets. Exam tip. Combine ordered durable messaging with an idempotent worker when the final channel lacks FIFO delivery. Question number 535. A Lambda function must connect to a private Aurora cluster during unpredictable traffic surges. The application needs private network access and controlled database connection. Pooling. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A. Make the Aurora cluster public and allow outbound database port traffic. Option B. Attach Lambda to the VPC with appropriate subnets and security groups and connect through an RDS proxy configured for the Aurora cluster. Option C. Attach a NAT gateway directly to the Lambda function. Option D. Configure only an RDS proxy while leaving Lambda outside the VPC. The correct answer is B. Attach Lambda to the VPC with appropriate subnets and security groups, and connect through an RDS proxy configured for the Aurora cluster. Here is why. VPC attachment provides private reachability, and RDS proxy pools database connections during unpredictable Lambda concurrency spikes. Why are the other options not correct? A. Public exposure is unnecessary, and the security group direction is incorrect. C. NAT does not provide private database access. D. A proxy alone does not give a non-VPC Lambda network reachability. Exam tip. Private Aurora access needs VPC networking. RDS proxy manages connection surges. Question number 536. An EC2 deployment through code deploy fails with im_role_permissions. The deployment group uses a service role that lacks the managed permissions required for EC2 in on-premises deployments. Which change resolves the error? Option A. Install the code deploy agent again on every instance. Option B. Attach AWS code deploy role ECS to the service role. Option C. Attach the AWS code deploy role managed policy to the code deploy service role. Option D. Change only the display deployment group role name without correcting its permissions. The correct answer is C. Attach the AWS code deploy role managed policy to the code deploy service role. Here is why. The EC2 and on-premises code deploy service role needs the permissions in AWS code deploy role to manage deployment group operations and associated resources. Why are the other options not correct? A. Agent installation does not correct service role authorization. B. AWS code deploy role ECS is for ECS blue/green deployments. D. A correct role name without the required permission still fails. Exam tip. Match the code deploy service role managed policy to the deployment compute platform. Question number 537. A Lambda function processes one S3 video object per invocation. Each object is at most 2 GB. The algorithm rereads the file many times, and the file can be discarded after processing. Which design provides the best input-output performance? Option A. Stream every reread directly from S3. Option B. Increase Lambda ephemeral storage to at least 2 GB. Copy the object once to /tmp, and perform repeated local reads. Option C. Attach an EBS volume to the function. Option D. Attach an ENA directly to the function. The correct answer is B. Increase Lambda ephemeral storage to at least 2 GB. Copy the object once to /tmp, and perform repeated local reads. Here is why. /tmp provides fast local storage for the invocation and avoids downloading the same large object from S3 for every reread. Why are the other options not correct? A. Repeated S3 GET operations add network latency. C. Lambda cannot directly attach EBS. D. Lambda does not expose direct ENA attachment as a function setting. Exam tip: increase Lambda ephemeral storage for large temporary files that require repeated local processing. Question number 538. A company that is already eligible to use S3 object Lambda stores credit reports in S3. An existing analytics client must continue making GET-style requests, but PI must be redacted before each response reaches the client. Which solution has the least operational overhead? Option A: move all reports into Redshift and rewrite the analytics application. Option B: configure an S3 object Lambda access point backed by a Lambda function that redacts PI from GET-OBJECT-responses. Option C: encrypt the objects with KMS and grant the analytics client decrypt permission. Option D: send every data access request through an SNS topic with message data protection. The correct answer is B. Configure an S3 object Lambda access point backed by a Lambda function that redacts PI from GET-OBJECT-responses. Here is why. Object Lambda transforms the object during retrieval, allowing the client to receive redacted content without modifying the stored object. Why are the other options not correct? A. Redshift requires migration and client changes. C. Encryption does not redact PI for an authorized reader. D. SNS message protection does not transform S3 GET responses. Exam tip: S3 object Lambda can transform eligible GET responses without changing source objects. Question number 539. A SAM project needs realistic local test events whose JSON structure matches events generated by AWS services. The team wants to avoid manually authoring each payload. Which command provides the lowest effort solution? Option A: SAM local invoke with an S3 URI for a manually created event. Option B: Lambda console shareable test events only. Option C: SAM local invoke with a locally handwritten JSON payload. Option D: SAM local generate event. The correct answer is D. SAM local generate event. Here is why. The SAM CLI generates sample payloads that match supported AWS service event schemas and can be piped into local invocation tests. Why are the other options not correct? A. SAM local invoke does not load an event from an S3 URI in this manner. B. Console test events do not provide the requested local generation workflow. C. Handwriting every payload requires more development effort. Exam tip: use SAM local generate event to create realistic service event payloads for local testing. Question number 540. An application runs on EC2 instances in an auto-scaling group. Session state must be externalized so any instance can handle the next request. Which two services can act as the shared session store? Choose two. Option A: Amazon SQS. Option B: Amazon Elastic Cache. Option C: Application Load Balancer. Option D: Amazon DynamoDB. E. Amazon Cognito. The correct answer is B. Amazon Elastic Cache. D. Amazon DynamoDB. Here is why. Both services provide shared network accessible state independent of any EC2 instance, allowing the auto-scaling web tier to remain stateless. Why are the other options not correct? A. SQS is a message queue, not a keyed session store. C. An ALB can provide stickiness, but does not persist session data. E. Cognito manages identities and tokens rather than arbitrary server-side session state. Exam tip: use Elastic Cache for low-latency sessions, or DynamoDB for durable scalable session storage. Question number 541. A media kernel API in AWS code commit. Every repository update must be compiled and subjected to THLED test cases for every build. Which solution meets these requirements? Option A: Invoke an AWS Lambda function for each repository update. Have the function compile the application, execute the tests, and store the results in a Lambda layer. Option B. Configure an AWS code build project to compile the code commit source and run the unit tests. Define code build test reports in the build specification. Option C. Use AWS code deploy to retrieve the application from code commit, execute the unit tests during deployment, and publish the results as CloudWatch metrics. Option D. Use Amazon Q Developer to generate the application code and execute the unit tests. Store the resulting report files in Amazon S3. The correct answer is B. Configure an AWS code build project to compile the code commit source and run the unit tests. Define code build test reports in the build specification. Here is why. Code build compiles source, runs unit tests, and creates structured test reports that developers can inspect by build or report group. Why are the other options not correct? A. Lambda layers package reusable code. They are not test result repositories. C. Code deploy deploys releases and does not provide code build test reporting. D. Amazon Q Developer assists development, but is not the managed build and test reporting service. Exam tip. Use code build for compilation, automated tests, build artifacts, and test reports. Use code deploy for deployment. Question number 542. A payment processing service runs under an IAM role in one AWS account. During runtime, the service retrieves a secret from AWS Secrets Manager in a second account. The secret is protected by a customer-managed AWS KMS key owned by the second account. Access to the secret has already been granted. Which action should the KMS key policy allow for the application role while following least privilege? Option A. Secret Manager. Describe secret and secret manager. Get secret value. Option B. KMS asterisk. Option C. KMS. Decrypt and KMS. Describe key. Option D. Secrets Manager asterisk. The correct answer is C. KMS. Decrypt and KMS. Describe key. Here is why. Secrets Manager must use the customer-managed KMS key to decrypt the secret's encrypted data key. These actions provide the required cross-account key usage without granting broad KMS access. Why are the other options not correct? A. Secrets Manager actions control access to the secret, not use of its KMS key. B. KMS asterisk grants substantially more key permissions than required. D. Secrets Manager asterisk is both overly broad and unrelated to the KMS key policy. Exam tip. Cross-account encrypted secret access can require secret access, caller IAM permissions, and permission in the customer-managed KMS key policy. Question number 543. A travel application team wants to expose a new release to a small percentage of production users, while the existing release continues serving everyone else. After the team validates the release, all remaining traffic must move to the new version in one operation. Which deployment strategy should the team use? Option A. Linear deployment. Option B. Canary deployment. Option C. All-at-once deployment. Option D. In-place deployment. The correct answer is B. Canary deployment. Here is why. A canary deployment sends an initial portion of traffic to the new release and, after validation, shifts the remaining traffic in a second step. Why are the other options not correct? A. Linear deployment shifts traffic through multiple equal increments. C. All at once exposes every user to the release immediately. D. In place describes updating the existing environment, not the required two-stage traffic shift. Exam tip. Canary means a small initial traffic shift followed by the remaining traffic, Linear uses repeated equal increments. Question number 544. A design firm uploads revised project documents to a versioned Amazon S3 bucket several times each day. The firm wants each object to retain only its current version and the single non-current version that immediately preceded it. Which solution should a developer implement? Option A. Suspend S3 versioning and modify the uploading application to count existing versions before each write. Option B. Add an S3 bucket policy that limits every object to one non-current version. Option C. Configure an S3 lifecycle rule that expires older non-current versions while retaining one newer non-current version. Option D. Enable S3 object lock and create a retention policy that preserves only one non-current object version. The correct answer is C. Configure an S3 lifecycle rule that expires older non-current versions while retaining one newer non-current version. Here is why. S3 lifecycle non-current version expiration supports retaining a specified number of newer non-current versions and deleting older versions. Why are the other options not correct? A. Suspending versioning does not automatically remove existing old versions and adds application-side management. B. Bucket policies control access and cannot enforce an object version count. D. Object lock enforces retention protection. It does not retain only the most recent non-current version. Exam tip. Use S3 lifecycle rules to transition or expire current and non-current object versions. Question number 545. A research organization stores laboratory recordings in Amazon S3. Object keys include the laboratory identifier. An existing Lambda function currently receives S3 object-created notifications and processes the files. The organization now wants each laboratory's existing Amazon SQ to receive only the S3 event messages for that laboratory. The Lambda function code must remain unchanged. Which solution meets these requirements? Option A. Configure the S3 bucket to publish every object-created notification directly to every laboratory queue. Option B. Modify the Lambda function so that it publishes each object location to the corresponding laboratory queue. Option C. Send the S3 notifications to one Amazon SNS topic. Subscribe the laboratory queues and apply subscription filter policies for the laboratory identifiers. Option D. Have the Lambda function write all object locations to one shared SQS queue and configure that queue to forward messages to the laboratory queues. The correct answer is C. Send the S3 notifications to one Amazon SNS topic. Subscribe the laboratory queues and apply subscription filter policies for the laboratory identifiers. Here is why. SNS provides managed fan-out to multiple SQS subscriptions, and subscription filtering routes each notification only to matching laboratory queues without changing the Lambda code. Why are the other options not correct? A. Publishing every event to every queue does not provide department-specific routing. B. This requires a Lambda code change. D. SQS queues do not natively fan out each message to multiple downstream SQS queues, and the option also changes the Lambda code. Exam tip. Use SNS fanout with subscription filtering when different subscribers need selected messages from one publisher. Question number 546. A development team is adding username and password sign-in with multi-factor authentication to a consumer mobile application. Which two actions should the team take? Choose two. Option A. Create IAM users for the application's end users. Option B. Create an Amazon Cognito user pool and register the application's users in the user pool. Option C. Enable MFA separately for the IAM users that represent the application's customers. Option D. Configure multi-factor authentication for the Amazon Cognito user pool. E. Add Amazon SNS Publish API calls to the mobile application to generate and validate MFA codes. The correct answer is B. Create an Amazon Cognito user pool and register the application's users in the user pool. D. Configure multi-factor authentication for the Amazon Cognito user pool. Here is why. A Cognito user pool provides the application user directory and authentication flow. Enabling MFA on the pool adds a supported second factor to user sign-in. Why are the other options not correct? A. IAM users are intended for AWS identities, not consumer application users. C. IAM user MFA does not add MFA to Cognito application sign-in. E. The app should respond to Cognito MFA challenges rather than independently generating and validating codes through SNS. Exam tip: Cognito user pools authenticate application users and can enforce SMS, email, or talk MFA. Question number 547. An insurance application contains many AWS Lambda functions that connect to the same Amazon RDS database. Database credentials must be protected centrally. After the credentials change, the functions must obtain the updated values without requiring a function deployment or configuration change. Which solution meets these requirements? Option A. Store the credentials as a secure string parameter in parameter store and reference the parameter directly from each Lambda environment variable. Option B. Store the credentials in AWS Secrets Manager and retrieve the current secret value at runtime from the Lambda functions. Option C. Store the credentials in Secrets Manager and inject them through the container definitions and value from properties as environment variables. Option D. Store the credentials as a secure string parameter and configure a trigger to push the value into each Lambda function at invocation time. The correct answer is B. Store the credentials in AWS Secrets Manager and retrieve the current secret value at runtime from the Lambda functions. Here is why. Runtime retrieval decouples the credentials from function code and configuration, allowing the functions to obtain an updated secret value after the stored credentials change. Why are the other options not correct? A. A plain environment variable reference does not dynamically resolve a parameter store value during each invocation. C. Container definitions and value from our Amazon ECS configuration constructs, not Lambda configuration. D. Parameter store does not push parameter values to Lambda through invocation triggers. Exam tip: retrieve changing secrets at runtime instead of embedding their values in code or static environment variables. Question number 548. A logistics company runs several applications on Amazon EC2. The applications share feature flags that change independently of application deployments. Each instance must periodically check for updates and serve the latest retrieved configuration from a local cache. Which solution provides the greatest operational efficiency? Option A. Store the flags in parameter store. Add application code that periodically calls parameter store through the AWS SDK and caches the response in memory. Option B. Store the flags in AWS AppConfig. Run AWS AppConfig agent on the instances and have the applications read the cached values from the agent's localhost endpoint. Option C. Store the flags in DynamoDB. Add DynamoDB accelerator and have the applications periodically query DynamoDB for the flag values. Option D. Store the flags in Secrets Manager. Use an elastic cache node as a lazy loading cache and have the applications pull elastic cache. The correct answer is B. Store the flags in AWS AppConfig. Run AWS AppConfig agent on the instances and have the applications read the cached values from the agent's localhost endpoint. Here is why. AppConfig is designed for application configuration and feature flags. Its agent periodically retrieves updates, maintains a local cache, and serves configuration through a localhost HTTP endpoint. Why are the other options not correct? A. This requires custom polling and caching code. C. DAX caches DynamoDB reads, but is not the direct managed feature flag deployment and retrieval solution. D. Secrets Manager and Elastic Cache add unnecessary services and operational work for non-secret feature flags. Exam tip: AppConfig agent handles configuration polling, token management, and local caching for applications. Question number 549. A publishing company has separate production and test AWS accounts. Production documents are stored in an Amazon S3 bucket and encrypted with a customer managed AWS KMS key. The documents will be copied to an S3 bucket owned by the test account. The destination objects must use a KMS key owned by the test account, and the production account must be permitted to use that destination key during the copy operation. Which solution meets these requirements? Option A. Create an AWS managed KMS key for Amazon S3 in the test account and edit its key policy to trust the production account. Option B. Replicate the production account's customer-managed KMS key into the test account and add the production account to the replica's key policy. Option C. Create a customer-managed KMS key in the test account and grant the production account the required permissions in the key policy. Option D. Replicate the production account's default AWS-managed Amazon S3 key into the test account and modify the replica's key policy. The correct answer is C. Create a customer-managed KMS key in the test account and grant the production account the required permissions in the key policy. Here is why. The destination account owns and controls the customer-managed key, and its editable key policy can authorize the production account to use the key during the cross-account copy. Why are the other options not correct? A. AWS managed keys cannot be edited to provide the required cross-account key access. B. KMS key replication does not copy a key into a different AWS account. D. Default AWS managed keys cannot be replicated across accounts or have their key policies customized this way. Exam tip: use a destination account customer managed KMS key when cross-account S3 encryption requires an editable key policy. Question number 550. A company has an AWS step function state machine named MyStateMachine. The company configured a service role for step functions. The developer must ensure that only the MyStateMachine state machine can assume the service role. Which statement should the developer add to the trust policy to meet this requirement? Condition: ARN like AWS source ARN YAWS states AP South 1:1111111111111 state machine MyStateMachine. Condition: ARN like AWS source ARN AWS states AP South 1 asterisk state machine MyStateMachine. Condition: string equals. Option C. AWS source account 11111111111. Condition: string not equals. Option D. AWS source ARN AWS states AP South 1:11111111111 state machine MyStateMachine. The correct answer is A. Use ARN like with AWS source ARN set to the complete ARN of MyStateMachine. Here is why. The full AWS source ARN restricts role assumption to the specific step function state machine. AWS recommends using AWS source ARN commonly together with AWS source account to prevent cross-service confused deputy access. Why are the other options not correct? B. The wildcard account ID allows a state machine with the same name from another AWS account. C. AWS. Source account restricts access to the account, but allows any eligible state machine in that account. D. String not equals permits every source ARN except my state machine, which reverses the requirement. Exam tip. Use the complete AWS source ARN when only one AWS resource should be allowed to use a service role. Question number 551. A data enrichment Lambda function produces messages that contain a customer category field. Depending on that field, each message must be delivered to only the applicable subset of 4 downstream Lambda consumers. Which design meets this requirement with the least operational overhead? Option A. Create one SQSQ and event source mapping for each consumer. Add all message routing decisions to the enrichment function. Option B. Publish every result to one Amazon SNS topic. Subscribe the 4 consumers. And configure an SNS subscription filter policy for each subscription. Option C. Create a dedicated SNS topic for each consumer and add topic selection logic to the enrichment function. Option D. Subscribe all 4 consumers to one SNS topic and implement the filtering in each consumer. Also subscribe the enrichment function to the same topic. The correct answer is B. Publish every result to one Amazon SNS topic. Subscribe the 4 consumers and configure an SNS subscription filter policy for each subscription. Here is why. A single SNS topic provides managed fan-out, while subscription filter policies prevent delivery to consumers whose criteria do not match the message field. Why are the other options not correct? A. Producer-side SQS routing adds custom logic and multiple queue integrations. C. Separate topics and producer routing add unnecessary resources and code. D. Delivering every message and filtering inside each consumer wastes invocations, and the producer should publish to rather than subscribe to the topic. Exam tip. Put routing criteria in SNS subscription filters to reduce producer-side logic and unnecessary consumer invocations. Question number 552. A healthcare web application receives forms through an Amazon CloudFront distribution. A request can contain more than 20 sensitive fields, all of which must remain encrypted as the request travels through the application. Only a limited set of backend components may decrypt those values. Which solution meets these requirements? Option A. Require HTTPS for the CloudFront cache behavior and restrict access by using CloudFront signed URLs or signed cookies. Option B. Attach AWS WAF to the distribution and use a Lambda function with self-managed symmetric keys to encrypt and decrypt the submitted values. Option C. Associate a Lambda at edge function with the distribution. Have the function perform field-level asymmetric encryption with an RSA public key whose corresponding private key is protected by AWS KMS. Option D. Create an asymmetric KMS key. Configure native CloudFront field-level encryption to use that KMS key, and forward all viewer headers to the origin. The correct answer is C. Associate a Lambda at edge function with the distribution. Have the function perform field-level asymmetric encryption with an RSA public key whose corresponding private key is protected by AWS KMS. Here is why. Custom edge logic can encrypt the required number of fields with a public key, while only components permitted to use the protected private key can decrypt the values. Why are the other options not correct? A. HTTPS and signed access protect transport and content access, but do not keep selected fields encrypted throughout application processing. B. AWS WAF does not perform field encryption, and self-managed symmetric keys weaken separation of encryption and decryption access. D. Native CloudFront field-level encryption uses public keys configured in CloudFront, not a KMS key directly, and supports only a limited number of encrypted fields per request. Exam tip. CloudFront field-level encryption protects selected request fields, but its field quota and public key configuration must fit the workload. Question number 553. A developer built an application that uses AWS Lambda functions to process images. The developer wants to improve image processing times throughout the day. The developer needs to create an Amazon Cloud Watch Logs Insights query that shows the average, slowest, and fastest processing time in 1-minute intervals. Which query will meet these requirements? Filter at type equals A. Stats average at duration. Max at duration. Min at duration by bin 1 lumen. Filter at type equals display. Stats average at duration. Max at duration. Min at duration by bin 5m. Filter at type equals stats. Stats average at duration. Max at duration. Min at duration by bin 5m. Filter at type equals pattern. Stats average at duration. Max at duration. Min at duration by bin lm. The correct answer is A. Here is why. Lambda report log entries contain the automatically discovered at duration field. The stats command calculates the average, maximum, and minimum duration, while bin 1m groups the results into 1-minute intervals. Why are the other options not correct? B. Display is not the Lambda log type that contains invocation duration data, and it groups results into 5-minute intervals. C. Stats is not the correct Lambda system log type, and bin 5m does not meet the 1-minute requirement. D. Pattern is not the Lambda duration report log type, even though it uses the correct interval. Exam tip. Filter Lambda performance queries on a type equals report and use a duration with stats aggregation. Question number 554. An online ticketing service stores reservations in a DynamoDB table whose partition key is reservation ID. A developer must retrieve all reservation IDs for one purchaser email value with a single query operation. The existing table must also remain extensible for additional query patterns based on other item attributes. Which solution meets these requirements? Option A. Replace reservation ID with purchaser email as the table's partition key. Option B. Add a global secondary index that uses purchaser email as its partition key. Option C. Add a local secondary index that uses purchaser email as its sort key. Option D. Change the table key schema so that purchaser email becomes the sort key while reservation ID remains the partition key. The correct answer is B. Add a global secondary index that uses purchaser email as its partition key. Here is why. A GSI can use a partition key that differs from the table's key, allowing a query by purchaser email. The table key is projected into the index, so reservation IDs can be returned. Why are the other options not correct? A. Replacing the table partition key disrupts the existing reservation ID access pattern and requires rebuilding the table. C. An LSI must share the table's partition key, so it cannot query all items by purchaser email. D. DynamoDB does not let an existing table's primary key schema be changed this way, and query would still require reservation ID. Exam tip. Use a GSI for an alternate partition key access pattern. An LSI keeps the base table partition key. Question number 555. A developer adds several large native libraries to an x86_64 Lambda function. The function can no longer be deployed because the combined uncompressed code and dependencies exceed the maximum size for a zip-based Lambda deployment package. Which solution allows the developer to deploy the function with all required dependencies? Option A. Change the Lambda function architecture from x86_64 to ARM64. Option B. Attach an Amazon EBS volume to the function and place the dependencies on the volume. Option C. Package the function and its dependencies as a Lambda-compatible container. image and deploy the image. Option D. Create a runtime snapshot containing the dependencies and configure the function to load the snapshot. The correct answer is C. Package the function and its dependencies as a Lambda-compatible container image and deploy the image. Here is why. Lambda container images support a substantially larger uncompressed package than zip-based deployments and can include the required x86_64 dependencies. Why are the other options not correct? A. Changing architectures does not remove the package size problem and can make x86_64 native libraries incompatible. B. Lambda functions cannot attach Amazon EBS volumes. D. Standard Lambda functions do not support dependency snapshots as a deployment package alternative. Exam tip: use a Lambda container image when code and dependencies exceed the zip deployment package quota. Question number 556. A legal services application encrypts confidential files before uploading them to Amazon S3. The security team needs a managed service that can identify sensitive files that were uploaded without the expected protection, continually evaluate the bucket security and access control posture, and issue notifications when findings occur. Which solution meets these requirements? Option A. Stream S3 object-created events to Amazon Kinesis and run a scheduled Lambda function that inspects the records and sends notifications. Option B. Enable Amazon May-C for the S3 data, configure the required discovery criteria, and use AWS user notifications for relevant May-C findings. Option C. Enable Amazon Inspector to scan the S3 objects and create an event bridge rule for inspector findings. Option D. Start Amazon Athena queries through step functions whenever an object is created and have Athena report bucket security issues. The correct answer is B. Enable Amazon May-C for the S3 data, configure the required discovery criteria, and use AWS user notifications for relevant May-C findings. Here is why. May-C discovers sensitive data in S3 and continually evaluates bucket security and access control issues. User notifications can deliver notifications for May-C finding events. Why are the other options not correct? A. This custom stream and scheduled function design adds operational work and does not provide May-C's managed S3 security assessment. C. Inspector assesses supported compute workloads and software vulnerabilities. It does not classify sensitive S3 data. D. Athena queries data but do not provide continuous S3 security posture monitoring. Exam tip: use May-C for sensitive data discovery and S3 bucket policy findings. Route findings through Event Bridge or AWS user notifications. Question number 557. A company's developer needs to activate Amazon CloudWatch Logs Insights for an application's AWS Lambda functions. The company uses an AWS Serverless Application Model, AWS SAM, template to deploy the application. The SAM template includes a logical resource that is named CloudWatch Log Group. How should the developer modify the SAM template to activate CloudWatch Logs Insights for the Lambda functions? Option A. Add an output named CloudWatch Insights rule that contains a value of the Amazon resource name, ARN, for the CloudWatch Log Group resource. Option B. Add a parameter named CloudWatch Log Group name prefix that contains a value of the application name. Reference the new parameter in the CloudWatch Log Group resource. Option C. For each Lambda function, add the layer for the Lambda Insights extension and the CloudWatch Lambda Insights execution role policy, AWS managed policy. Option D. For each Lambda function, set tracing mode to active and add the CloudWatch Lambda Insights execution role policy, AWS managed policy. The correct answer is C. For each Lambda function, add the layer for the Lambda Insights extension and the CloudWatch Lambda Insights execution role policy AWS managed policy. Here is why. CloudWatch Lambda Insights requires two components for each function. 1. The Lambda Insights extension layer, and 2. The CloudWatch Lambda Insights execution role policy attached to the function's execution role. These can be configured in the AWS SAM template. Why are the other options not correct? A CloudFormation output only exposes a resource value. It does not enable monitoring. B. Changing the log group name or prefix does not enable Lambda Insights. D. Tracing. Active enables AWS X-ray tracing. It does not install the Lambda Insights extension. Exam tip. Lambda Insights requires both the extension layer and its execution role policy. X-ray active tracing is a separate observability feature. You have completed part 14 of the DVA-C02 practice series. Continue your preparation by opening the complete playlist and watching the remaining parts in sequence. Please like this video, subscribe to Tech with Kaushik, and enable notifications for more certification exam preparation content. Share your score, questions, or feedback in the comments. Thank you for watching. See you in the next part.